Dust curled in lazy spirals behind the stagecoach as it rattled to a stop before Willow Creek's general store, like the land itself was holding its breath. Margaret Sullivan tightened her grip on a tired carpetbag and squinted through the grimy window at the frontier town that might save her or swallow her whole. At 43, with silver threading her dark hair and grief carved fine around her green eyes, she wasn't the usual westbound dreamer. She was what came after dreams: stubborn will, thin coin, and one last chance. "End of the line, ma'am. Willow Creek." The driver's voice snapped her loose from memory. She stepped down with 2 bags, everything left of a Philadelphia life, and the red dust leaped to claim her black traveling dress, the same dress she'd worn 8 months earlier to a funeral she still smelled on her skin. She'd sold everything else for this journey, chasing a hope ripped from a newspaper like a secret. An advertisement small as a postage stamp and hot as a brand in her pocket. The town was one rutted street pretending to be a future. A mercantile, a saloon called the Lucky Strike, a beat-up boarding house, and a handful of buildings clinging together as if afraid of the emptiness beyond. Mountains crouched on the horizon, early snow on their peaks, while October's sun still warmed the valley like a promise it might not keep. Margaret felt how wrong she looked here. Eastern cut, practical fabric, polished shoes. A woman alone, older, careful-mannered, heads lifted outside the saloon, eyes narrow with curiosity and caution. She straightened, set her jaw, and walked the boardwalk toward the general store, the advert burning her palm like a dare. The bell over the door jangled. Inside, shadow, clutter, shelves stacked with everything from flour to ammunition. A thin man with spectacles bent over a ledger, the paper whispering under his pen. "Help you, ma'am?" he asked, voice carefully polite, like a lock half-turned. "I'm here about the Circle M, the cook position." She unfolded the advertisement with the care of a love letter. His head snapped up. "That posting's 2 months old. Circle M's 20 miles out, rough country. Not exactly suited to." His glance skimmed her bonnet, her city shoes, and the sentence died on his tongue. "I can cook," she said evenly, smooth as silk over steel. It felt like a lie that had lived so long inside her it had begun to tell the truth. He scratched his jaw. "It isn't only cooking. Jake Caldwell runs a hard outfit. No women on site. Just prairie, cattle, and men who haven't seen a parlor in months." "I'm a widow," she answered, voice steady despite the hammer in her ribs. "No family back east. No income. I need this job." Something in her tone softened his eyes. "Can you ride?" "I can learn." "Ever used a wood stove? Baked bread from scratch? Butchered a chicken?" "I'm a quick study." He sighed and set down his pen. "Jake's fair but short on patience. That ranch has chewed through stronger cooks than you look." One of them walked off into the prairie rather than stay another day. Margaret felt doubt slide icy fingers along her spine, then shooed it away. Maybe they had options. I don't. He looked at her for a long beat, then nodded. "Supply wagon rolls to the Circle M at dawn. If you're set on it, you can ride along." "I'm set. There's a room at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house. Tell her I sent you." He hesitated, gentling his voice. "You'll want sturdier clothes. What you're wearing won't last a week." She glanced down at the dust-blotted black dress. "Thank you." From the meager selection she bought 2 calico dresses, stout boots, and a wide-brimmed hat, practical armor for a new life. As he wrapped the parcels, the storekeeper asked quietly, "What brings a lady with education in her voice to Willow Creek?" "My husband was a physician," she said. "When he died, I inherited debts, and nothing else. This post offered room, board, and pay." The simple facts felt heavier than confession. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, sincere. "But ranch cooking eats daylight and strength. Those boys can complain like children." Margaret's mouth curved. "I've managed a Philadelphia household on a vanishing budget for 20 years. I can manage hungry cowboys." The storekeeper chuckled softly. "You've got spirit. I'll give you that. Caldwell may like it, or it might rub him raw. Hard to say." Margaret's voice lowered. "Tell me about him." "Jake Caldwell's been running the Circle M near a decade. Came up from Texas. Keeps to himself. Pays fair. Works harder than anyone. Some say he's got no use for women." Others whisper he's just never met one tough enough to survive out there. Margaret tucked this away like a note pinned inside her pocket. I'll be ready at dawn. Stepping into the street again, she felt the weight of stairs follow her. A widow in a strange town, on the edge of nowhere. A woman about to step off the edge entirely. The boarding house was gray and weary-looking, like a grandmother who'd seen too much. Mrs. Patterson, sharp-eyed and brisk, scanned Margaret up and down before handing over a room key. "You're heading to the Circle M, aren't you?" she said. Her tone balanced between admiration and pity. "Brave or foolish? Haven't decided which." "Perhaps a bit of both," Margaret admitted, setting down her carpetbags. "Don't expect chatter from Caldwell," Mrs. Patterson added with a sniff. "He's as cold as a January creek. Fair, though. Never heard of him lifting a hand unless someone deserved it." Alone at last, Margaret sat on the narrow bed. The room was clean but bare. A washstand, a single chair, a window that opened on endless prairie. She smoothed out the advertisement. Such a small scrap of paper to send her so far from everything familiar. But what choice had she truly had? A factory would never hire her. Family back east had troubles of their own. Charity was worse than hunger. Her fingers clenched around the paper. This is my only chance. I won't waste it. Night brought unfamiliar sounds. Piano music drifting from the saloon. Horses nickering. A coyote's far-off cry. Margaret lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her resolve hardening like iron cooling in a forge. Dawn came cold and pink. She boarded the supply wagon driven by old Pete, a man as weathered as the prairie. His words were few, his silence heavy. Mile by mile, the civilized edges of Willow Creek fell away. Golden prairie grass stretched unbroken, dotted with lonely cottonwoods and bone-dry creek beds. The world felt bigger than Margaret had ever imagined, and far more dangerous. "There," Pete finally said, pointing ahead. A wooden gate marked with a burned-in brand. "Circle M. 3 miles more." Margaret's stomach tightened like a fist. She rehearsed confident words in her mind, but they scattered like startled birds when the ranch came into view. The Circle M sprawled in a natural bowl of land. A main house of rough-hewn logs, a massive barn, corrals teeming with horses, a bunkhouse, smokehouse, and outbuildings scattered like chess pieces. It was larger than she'd dared hope and lonelier. No curtains in the windows, no flowers by the steps, just work and survival etched into every plank. Pete hauled the wagon to a stop. "Wait here. I'll fetch Jake." Margaret stayed frozen, clutching her bag. Through the kitchen window, she glimpsed a hulking iron stove, her future opponent. The door opened. Out stepped Jake Caldwell. Margaret's breath caught. She'd imagined an older man, rough and heavy from years of hard living. Instead, he was tall and lean. Mid-30s, maybe. His strength clear in every movement. Sunlight struck his dark hair, revealing streaks of premature silver at the temples. His steel-gray eyes were sharp enough to slice through lies and through her, if she faltered. He wore plain work clothes, but there was something in his stance. An effortless authority that belonged equally to a ballroom or a battlefield. He stopped at the bottom of the steps, thumbs hooked in his belt, and studied her in silence. It stretched long enough for Margaret's nerves to fray. "Mrs. Sullivan," Pete said into the void. "Come about the cook position." Jake's gaze never left her face. When he finally spoke, his voice was deep and edged with a Texas drawl. "Ever cook for 15 hungry men?" Margaret lifted her chin. "No, Mr. Caldwell. But I can learn." "This isn't a schoolhouse," he said flatly. "I need someone who can do the job. Now." "Then why has the position stayed empty for 2 months?" The words slipped out, bold as a slap. Something flickered in those gray eyes. Approval? Surprise? It vanished as quickly as it came. "Because most people are smart enough to run the other way." He stepped closer, his shadow falling across her boots. "Ranch cooking means waking at 4, breakfast by 5, packing lunches for men on the range, dinner hot when they return, bread, meat, coffee on a stove with a mind of its own." "I understand," she said steadily, though her pulse thrashed in her ears. "Do you?" His gaze pinned her. "Can you haul water from the well? Kill and pluck chickens? Lift a full pot of stew? Because there's no one here to do it for you." Margaret's throat burned, but her voice rang clear. 3 months ago, I buried my husband and learned I was penniless. 2 months ago, I sold everything to settle debts that weren't mine. 1 month ago, I slept in a railway station. Necessity, Mr. Caldwell, is the best teacher I know. Silence swallowed the yard. Even the horses stilled. Jake studied her as though he could see straight through to the truth of her soul. Finally, he turned to Pete. "Bring her bags to the kitchen." Margaret's breath caught. "Does that mean?" "It means you've got 1 week to prove you belong here," Jake said, already striding toward the house. "If you fail, Pete will take you back to town on his next run." Jake paused at the door, glancing over his shoulder. His eyes were sharp, unreadable. "One more thing, Mrs. Sullivan. The men here are good, but they're cowboys. They curse, they stink of horses, and they haven't seen a woman in months. You'll eat in the kitchen. Stay inside after dark. Keep your distance. Clear?" "Perfectly clear," Margaret replied, even as unease twisted inside her. "Good." His boots thudded on the porch steps as he vanished into the shadows of the house. Pete gave her a knowing look. "Best do as he says. These men respect Caldwell, but they're wild as mustangs." He hefted her carpet bags. "Come on. Let's get you settled." Inside, the kitchen was large but brutally plain. The cast-iron stove loomed like a sleeping beast against one wall. A battered wooden table dominated the center, scarred by years of use. Open shelves lined with mismatched dishes and heavy pots gave the room a stripped-down feel. No flowers, no color, just bare necessity. "Your room's through there," Pete said, nodding to a small door off the kitchen. "Private, at least. Water's in that barrel. Firewood stacked out back. We haul water every morning. You'll be doing plenty of that." Margaret's gaze lingered on the stove. It seemed to watch her back, daring her to fail. "This monster," Pete added with a smirk, "likes to play tricks. Too much wood, you'll burn dinner. Too little, you'll serve it raw. Dampers are fussy. Oven runs hot on the right." She swallowed. "Any other peculiarities?" "Yeah. The men like their coffee so strong it could float a horseshoe. Don't forget that." Pete grinned, then left her alone with the beast. Margaret set her bag down and surveyed her battlefield. 4 hours until dinner. 15 men expecting a feast. No servants. No modern conveniences. Only her, the stove, and a pantry of staples. She tied on a plain apron she'd found hanging by the door and rolled up her sleeves. "You survived Philadelphia society," she muttered. "You can survive this." The pantry revealed flour, salt, lard, dried beans, potatoes, onions, and a slab of beef hanging ominously in the corner. "Stew," she decided. "Meat, vegetables, water, salt. Simple. In theory." The fire refused to cooperate. When she coaxed it to life, it roared, scorching the pot. When she tried to calm it, it nearly died. Smoke curled up the chimney, stinging her eyes. The knives were dull, her hands were soft, and blisters bloomed as she chopped vegetables unevenly. The heavy stew pot mocked her, too weighty to lift when full. She ladled water cup by cup, biting back frustrated tears. 3 hours later, the kitchen looked like a battlefield. Flour dusted every surface, her hair had escaped its pins, and the stew boiled with a temper of its own. "You look like you're wrestling a bear." Margaret spun, heart pounding. A young cowboy stood in the doorway, hat in hand. He couldn't have been more than 20, his freckled face open and friendly. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said quickly. "Didn't mean to scare you. Name's Tom Bradley. Jake sent me to see if you needed firewood." "Yes, thank you." Then, desperate for guidance, she blurted, "Tom, what makes a stew good to you cowboys?" Tom grinned. "Mostly that it's hot and there's plenty of it. We ain't picky, ma'am. Though Jake's got finer tastes than most. Comes from bein' raised proper, I reckon." Margaret's spoon paused. "Mr. Caldwell, raised proper?" "Far as anyone knows," Tom said, stacking firewood. Some say he came from a good Texas family, maybe even college. But something went wrong. He never talks about it. So, the stern rancher wasn't always a man of silence and cattle. Margaret filed the thought away, even as anxiety churned in her stomach. By the time the dinner bell clanged outside, Margaret had stew that looked edible, biscuits slightly burned on the bottom, and coffee so dark it might truly float a horseshoe. The cowboys filed in, dusty and ravenous. They nodded awkwardly, mumbling, "Ma'am," as they took their seats. Jake entered last, his presence commanding instant quiet. His eyes swept the table, pausing briefly on Margaret before he sat at the head. "Gentlemen," he said, voice low but carrying, "this is Mrs. Sullivan, our new cook. Mind your manners." The meal unfolded in tense silence. Spoons clinked, biscuits were passed, and Margaret's pulse pounded louder than the stove crackle. No one complained, but no one praised either. Jake ate slowly, methodically, as though testing each bite. His face revealed nothing. When the last man shoved his chair back, Jake stood. "Mrs. Sullivan." A word. Outside, the sunset bathed the prairie in molten gold. Margaret's hands twisted in her apron. "Well?" she asked, bracing for judgment. The stew was underseasoned. The biscuits were heavy, and the coffee, his mouth twitched, could strip paint. Margaret's cheeks flamed. "I'll improve." "But," Jake added, and his tone shifted, "you kept trying when the stove fought you. You asked for help instead of pretending you knew everything. That shows sense. Does that mean I stay?" "It means you get your week, like I promised." He studied her for a moment, something unreadable flickering in his gaze. "Can you read and write?" "Yes, of course." "Good. The ranch books need keeping. My handwriting's a disaster. Do that along with cooking, and I'll add extra to your wages." Margaret blinked, startled by the unexpected offer. "Thank you." He started to leave, then stopped. "One more thing. Earlier you said you'd bring food. Can you also bring laughter?" Margaret stared, caught off guard. "Laughter? This is hard country," Jake said quietly. "Work breaks backs. Loneliness breaks spirits. The last cook looked like she was at a funeral every meal. It dragged everyone down." His voice softened, almost wistful. "Sometimes a kitchen needs more than food." Margaret thought of her old life in Philadelphia, lavish dinner parties where she had charmed guests through sheer willpower, keeping conversation lively even when the roast was ruined or the wine ran dry. "Yes, Mr. Caldwell," she said softly. "I can bring more than food." This time, she swore she saw approval flicker in his gray eyes. "4 hours until breakfast. You'll need every minute," he said before disappearing into the night. Left alone, Margaret breathed deeply and faced the looming stove once more. This battle wasn't just about meals, it was about survival, dignity, and proving herself. By dawn, the kitchen smelled of bacon and biscuits instead of smoke and failure. Margaret's hands were blistered, her back screamed, but breakfast was ready. The men filed in, surprised by the warm, golden biscuits and thick gravy on the table. Even Jake's eyebrow lifted slightly in what might have been approval. Margaret almost smiled, but her triumph was short-lived. By mid-morning, disaster struck. The stew pot for dinner tipped unexpectedly, spilling scalding broth across the floor. Margaret slipped, catching herself on the edge of the table, her heart hammering. She barely had time to mop up before Tom Bradley burst in, pale and breathless. "Mrs. Sullivan, Tom's horse threw him." His arms broke clean through. Margaret's training as a doctor's wife surged to the surface. "Bring him here. Now!" 2 cowboys carried Tom into the kitchen, his face white with pain. Margaret's movements were quick and calm as she examined the injury. "It's a clean break," she announced. "I can set it." "You know how?" Jake's voice came from the doorway, sharp with surprise. "My late husband was a physician. I've assisted him many times." Margaret replied without hesitation. "I need boards for splints, clean cloth, and someone to hold him steady." Jake didn't question her. He barked orders, and within moments, supplies appeared. Margaret knelt beside Tom. "This will hurt, but it must be done." "Just do it, ma'am." Tom gritted out. With one swift motion, she aligned the bones. Tom's scream echoed through the house, but when it ended, the break was set. Sweat beaded Margaret's brow as she wrapped the splint with strips of her own petticoat. Keep it still for 6 weeks. No exceptions. Tom's breathing steadied. Thank you, ma'am. Thought I'd have to ride to town. You wouldn't have made it halfway, Jake muttered, his face unreadable as he helped lift Tom to a cot. He turned to Margaret. Where did a Philadelphia lady learn to do that? Margaret's hands froze. The truth spilled out before she could stop it. When you're married to a man who drinks, Mr. Caldwell, you learn to act when his hands aren't steady enough. A heavy silence filled the kitchen. Margaret bent over the sling she was fashioning, cheeks burning with shame. Finally, Jake said quietly, "Whatever brought you here, today it saved a man's future. Thank you." He left, giving her the gift of privacy. Margaret's heart pounded. She hadn't meant to reveal that part of her past. It felt both terrifying and freeing. When Tom was resting, she returned to her cooking. Hands trembling, Jake's voice echoed in her mind, softer than she'd ever heard it. That night, dinner was a triumph. Perfectly seasoned, stew, fluffy biscuits, and coffee so rich it drew sighs of pleasure from the cowboys. As she set a pie on the table, someone shouted, "Pie! Actual pie!" Laughter burst out like a cork popping. Even Jake's stoic face cracked, a tiny smile tugging at his mouth. "Not bad, Mrs. Sullivan," he murmured. Tom, his arm in a sling, grinned widely. "Could be made of sawdust and we'd still love it." The men roared with laughter, the sound bouncing off the walls. For the first time, Margaret felt like she belonged. Jake caught her eye across the table, his expression softer than she'd ever seen. "My mother used to say a kitchen without laughter was just a room with a stove," he said quietly. Margaret's throat tightened. "Then tonight, Mr. Caldwell, we have a real kitchen." After the meal, Jake lingered as the others filed out, his voice low. "You did more than cook today. You reminded these men what home feels like." Margaret couldn't find words. She only nodded, clutching her apron to hide her trembling hands. As he turned to go, she realized something startling. This place wasn't just saving her. She was saving it too. That night, alone in her small room, she wept not from grief this time, but from a fragile, dawning hope. The weeks began to settle into a rhythm. Margaret rose before dawn without needing the rooster's crow, her hands finding kindling and matches in the dark as naturally as breathing. The once hostile stove now behaved under her firm guidance. She learned its moods, coaxing steady heat instead of wild swings. It was no longer her enemy. It was her weapon. Little by little, the kitchen transformed. Margaret sewed checkered curtains from an old tablecloth. She placed a jar of dried wildflowers by the window, tiny touches of beauty amid the starkness. Mint grew wild near the smokehouse. She gathered it, hanging bunches to dry. Soon, the air held a fresh, green scent that reminded her of her grandmother's garden. Tom Bradley, his arm healing well, started visiting early in the mornings. He'd sit at the table, chattering while Margaret worked, his easy humor filling the room. "Smells like my grandmother's kitchen," he said one morning, inhaling deeply as biscuits baked golden in the oven. "Did she live on a ranch?" Margaret asked, sliding a pie into the stove. "No, ma'am. Little house in Missouri. She always said a kitchen without growing things was like a church without hymns." Margaret smiled softly. "Your grandmother was a wise woman. You've made this place feel alive again," Tom added, more serious now. "The men, they laugh more. Stay longer after meals. It feels like home." Margaret's heart swelled at his words. She'd noticed it too. The cowboys bringing small gifts, a chicken, wild honey, a handful of pecans as tokens of thanks. Just as she opened her mouth to reply, Tom's tone turned curious. "Can I ask you something, ma'am?" "Of course. What do you know about Jake's past?" Margaret paused, rolling dough beneath her hands. She'd glimpsed hints, his educated speech, his skill with numbers, the loneliness that clung to him, but he never spoke of it. "Only what he's chosen to share," she said carefully. "Why do you ask?" "Sometimes," Tom said, lowering his voice, I catch him looking at you like you've brought back a memory he thought he'd lost." Margaret's cheeks warmed. Before she could respond, a voice cut through the doorway. "Bradley," Jake said sharply. "If that arm's well enough for gossip, it's well enough for chores." Tom leapt to his feet. "Yes, sir." He shot Margaret a sheepish grin before hurrying out. Jake lingered, filling the doorway with his broad shoulders. "The boy talks too much." Margaret kept her focus on the pie dough, though her heart thudded. "He's young. Talking keeps the silence away." Jake's voice was quieter now. "Is that what you think? That it's too quiet here?" She dared to glance up. "I think a man who asks for laughter at his table might be tired of silence." For a moment, his guarded expression cracked. "My wife loved to sing while she cooked," he said softly. "Sarah." Margaret froze. "Wife?" The word echoed like a gunshot. "2 years before I came here," Jake continued, his gaze far away. "Fever took her. And our little girl." Margaret's breath caught. "I'm so sorry." His knuckles whitened around his coffee cup. "I was away on business. Building a future, I thought. Came home to 2 graves and a house that echoed." The silence stretched, heavy and intimate. Then Jake straightened, pushing the memory away like a door slammed shut. "There's a harvest dance in town Saturday," he said briskly. "The men are going." "How nice for them," Margaret replied, trying to keep her voice neutral. "You'll come too," Jake said simply. "You need supplies." And, his words faltered, uncharacteristic uncertainty creeping in. "If you happen to stop by the dance hall, and I happen to be there." Margaret's lips curved despite herself. "That's quite a lot of coincidence, Mr. Caldwell." "Jake," he corrected quietly. "When it's just conversation, call me Jake." He left before she could answer, leaving Margaret standing amid flour-dusted counters and a heart beating far too fast. That evening, he returned with a package wrapped in brown paper. "This was my mother's," he said, almost gruffly. "Might need altering." Then he was gone again, before she could thank him. Inside lay a simple dress of deep blue wool, beautiful in its quiet way. The color would make her green eyes glow. Margaret pressed the fabric to her chest, overcome. Late into the night, she sewed by lamplight, reshaping the dress with careful stitches. Each thread was a promise to herself, to Jake, to the fragile possibility of something new. Saturday dawned clear and cold, the prairie glittering with frost. Margaret dressed in the altered gown, pinning her hair simply, her heart fluttering like a girl's. When Jake arrived, he was freshly shaved, wearing a dark coat that revealed city tailoring beneath the ranch dust. For a moment, Margaret could only stare. The ride to town passed in unexpected ease. Jake even laughed when she recounted her disastrous first week with the stove. It felt almost normal, almost like courtship. But as the sun set and they approached town, black clouds gathered on the horizon, the wind rising with a warning howl. Jake's jaw tightened. "Storm's coming," he said grimly, "and it's going to be a bad one." Margaret shivered, sensing that the dance might be the least of what lay ahead. By the time they reached Willow Creek, the sky had turned an ominous green-black. Winds howled like 1,000 wolves. Dust and leaves spiraled in wild circles, stinging Margaret's face. "It's going to be brutal," Jake muttered, scanning the horizon. "We need to get back to the ranch fast." The dance was instantly forgotten. He urged the horses hard, their hooves thundering across the prairie as the first fat raindrops splattered against Margaret's bonnet. By the time they reached the Circle M, the wind was shrieking and the air felt charged, alive with danger. "Most of the men are out driving the herds to higher ground," Jake told her, jumping from the wagon. "I need to ride out. You stay here and keep the kitchen lit. Warm. Safe." Margaret gripped his arm. "Jake, it's madness to go out there." His gaze locked with hers, fierce and unyielding. "If we lose those cattle, we lose the ranch. And if any men are caught out there—" He didn't finish, but she understood. The stakes were life and death. "Promise me you'll come back," she whispered. He gave a grim nod, then was gone, a shadow, swallowed by the storm. Margaret stood frozen for a moment, rain lashing the windows, the howl of the wind rattling the very walls. Then she drew a deep breath and moved. "Tom," she called, spotting him near the porch, his arm still in its sling. "Get Pete. Fill every container with water, the well might flood. Charlie, bring in every stick of firewood you can find." The young cowboy's face lit with fierce respect. "Yes, ma'am." Margaret's voice cut through the storm like a general's. "This kitchen will stay warm and bright. These men will come back to safety and food." As the others worked, she attacked her own preparations. Dough for loaves of bread, beans soaking, a vast pot of stew, simmering steadily. Her hands flew, her heart hammering as she thought of Jake somewhere out there in the darkness. The storm hit at full force, just after 3. Rain hammered the roof like a drum. Wind screamed, tearing at shutters and doors. It was a primal sound, the voice of the wilderness itself. Pete peered through the rattling window. "Lord above," he muttered. Last storm like this took the old barn clean off its foundation. Margaret lit every lantern, turning the kitchen into a golden beacon amid the darkness. The smell of baking bread and coffee filled the air, battling the scent of wet earth and fear. "Riders coming," Charlie shouted, barely audible over the gale. 4 men staggered in, drenched and shivering, their faces pale with exhaustion. Margaret thrust steaming mugs of coffee into their hands, her calmness steadying them. "Jake?" she asked, forcing her voice to stay even. "He sent us back," one man said through chattering teeth. "Said he and Hank would keep looking for Bill and Frank. Last seen near the north pasture." Margaret's stomach dropped like a stone. The north pasture was 15 miles away. "Sit. Eat," she ordered firmly. "You'll do no good to anyone half frozen." The hours had crawled by. Each time the door banged open, her heart leapt only to fall again when it wasn't Jake. More riders staggered in, bringing tales of near misses with flash floods and lightning strikes. Each report ended the same way. Jake's still out there. Night fell, though it was hard to tell, with the storm's darkness pressing in on all sides. Margaret kept the food coming, the fire blazing, her hands moving automatically as her mind painted terrifying pictures. "Light!" Charlie suddenly shouted, pointing through the sheets of rain. "I see a lantern." Margaret rushed to the door as 3 flickering lights appeared like willow, the wisps in the storm. Men shouted, hauling the door open against the wind's fury. 4 figures stumbled inside Jake and Hank, supporting 2 others so caked in mud they looked like statues. "Blankets!" Jake barked, his voice hoarse. "Hot water!" "Bill's got a bad gash." Margaret snapped into action. "On the table now!" Bill's leg was a mess of blood and torn flesh. Margaret cleaned it with swift precision, stitching the wound while Jake held the lantern steady despite his own swaying exhaustion. "You need to sit," she said sharply. "Tom, get your boss some coffee before he falls over." "I'm fine," Jake muttered. But when Tom pressed a mug into his hands, he sank onto a bench, pale beneath the mud streaks. When Bill was finally bandaged, Margaret turned to Jake. "You saved them." His gaze met hers, weary but unwavering. "We saved them. This kitchen, you kept them alive as much as I did." The words hit her like a blow, leaving her breathless. In his eyes, she saw more than gratitude. She saw trust. "You should rest," she whispered, afraid of breaking the moment. "Not yet," he said, standing unsteadily. "But, thank you, Margaret." Hearing her name in his voice was more intimate than any touch. She swallowed hard, tears stinging her eyes. As he staggered toward the door, she called softly, "Next time you decide to be a hero, try doing it before midnight. These late rescues are terrible for my complexion." His laugh, rough and rusty, but real, carried back to her through the storm. It warmed her more than the roaring fire. And in that laugh, Margaret felt the shift. Something fragile and precious had begun between them, forged in wind and rain and courage. Outside, the tempest still raged, but inside, the Circle M, there was light and hope. The storm spent itself just before dawn, leaving the prairie drenched and shining under pale morning light. Margaret stood at the window, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. Her eyes burned from sleeplessness, but she didn't care. Every man was accounted for. Every soul had made it through the night. When Jake appeared, mud-streaked and bone-weary, He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. "Did you sleep at all?" he asked quietly. "Did you?" she countered, arching an eyebrow. A wry smile ghosted across his lips. Touché. They shared a moment of silent understanding. Two warriors who had fought different battles but for the same cause. "I'll make breakfast," Margaret said, turning to the stove. "You wake the men." As she kneaded biscuit dough, she thought of how far she'd come. This kitchen was no longer a battlefield, it was her stronghold. When Jake's laughter drifted back from the bunkhouse, a sound she'd never heard before, it sent a flutter through her chest that had nothing to do with exhaustion. The days that followed were a blur of repair and rebuilding. Fences had to be mended, scattered cattle gathered. The damaged barn roof patched before winter truly set in. Jake threw himself into the work, his presence on the range constant and commanding. Margaret rarely saw him except at meals, where his conversation was clipped, focused on ranch matters. But she could feel him watching her, a weight of unspoken words, whenever their eyes met. It was Tom who finally broke the silence. "You two are dancing around each other worse than green colts," he said one afternoon, helping Margaret peel potatoes with his healed arm. Margaret flushed crimson. "I don't know what you mean." "Sure you don't," Tom said with a knowing grin. "And Jake doesn't spend half his time staring at the kitchen window when he thinks no one's looking." Before she could respond, the pounding of hooves broke through the chatter. Horses galloped hard toward the house, too fast for anything but trouble. Jake and Hank swung from their saddles, urgency etched in their faces. Across Hank's lap lay a limp, blood-soaked figure. Margaret's breath caught. "Who?" "Will Morrison," Jake barked. "Gored by a bull. It's bad. Bring him inside." Margaret's voice snapped into command mode. "On the table. Now." The kitchen became a makeshift operating room in seconds. Margaret's hands moved with practiced precision, her mind a calm center amid chaos. "Boil water. Clean cloths," she ordered. "Tom, my sewing basket, the one with the silk thread." Jake hovered beside her, his face taut. "Margaret, if it's too much." "It's not too much," she interrupted sharply. "But everyone must do exactly as I say." They obeyed without question. Will's breathing was ragged, his face pale as chalk. Margaret stitched internal damage with silk thread, boiled sterile, then packed the wound with honey-soaked cloth, an old remedy she trusted with her whole heart. Through it all, Jake held Will's shoulders, speaking low and steady. "You're going to be fine, son. Mrs. Sullivan's got the best hands in Texas." Hours passed like minutes. When she finally tied off the last stitch, her arms trembled with fatigue. But Will's pulse was stronger. "He needs complete rest," she told Jake, "and someone watching him every moment. If fever comes, we fight it immediately." "Then we'll take shifts," Jake said without hesitation. "Whatever it takes." They moved Will carefully to Margaret's small room near the warm kitchen, ignoring her protests about sleeping on the kitchen settle. That night, Margaret sat beside the bed, while Jake took the first watch. His presence was a solid anchor against the terror of what might come. "You were remarkable today," he said quietly, his voice roughened by awe. "I've seen field surgeons with less skill." "I was terrified," Margaret admitted. "In Philadelphia, I only assisted. My husband bore the weight of decisions. Today," her hands shook. "Today it was all me." "You saved him," Jake said simply. "And you saved this ranch from burying another boy." Margaret turned to look at him. Truly look. His eyes were raw, his guard stripped away by exhaustion and gratitude. "Jake," she began, but he shook his head. "Don't. Not yet." His voice was thick with unspoken emotion. "We'll talk when Will's safe." As dawn broke, Will stirred, his fever mercifully low. Margaret slumped against the wall, finally allowing herself to breathe. Jake draped a blanket over her shoulders. "Get some rest. You've done more than enough." But when she closed her eyes, she knew this wasn't just about duty anymore. Somewhere between fire and storm, stitches and laughter, something had taken root between her and Jake, a fragile, growing thing she couldn't yet name. 3 days passed in a haze of vigilance. Will's fever spiked the second night, sending the household into controlled panic. Margaret bathed his burning skin with cool water and spooned bitter willow bark tea between his cracked lips. Jake never left her side, fetching water, holding Will still, and lending his steady presence when her own strength faltered. When the fever finally broke near dawn, relief crashed over them like a tidal wave. Will's eyes fluttered open, clearer than before. "Ma'am," he croaked. "Did I miss breakfast?" Margaret laughed through tears of exhaustion. "Several breakfasts, young man. But when you're stronger, I'll make you the finest one in Texas." Later, Margaret stepped outside to breathe the crisp morning air. The prairie shimmered under a fragile veil of mist. She swayed from weariness, and suddenly Jake's arms were there, steadying her. "You did it," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. "You brought him back to us." "We did it," she corrected, leaning into his warmth before she could think better of it. "I couldn't have managed without you." He was silent for a beat. Then she felt the curve of his smile against her hair. "We make a good team." The words hung between them, weighted with unspoken possibilities. Margaret knew she should pull away, return to propriety, but she stayed. Just for a moment longer. "Margaret," Jake said softly, "when Will's recovered, we need to talk. Really talk. About the future." Her heart skipped painfully. "About what kind of future? About whether this is just a job for you," he said, voice low, "or if it could be something more." Before she could respond, Tom's voice called from inside. "Mrs. Sullivan, Will's asking for more tea." The moment shattered. Margaret stepped back, smoothing her apron, not meeting Jake's eyes. "I should go," she said quickly. But as she turned, Jake caught her hand. "Just think about it, please." She squeezed his fingers briefly. "I've been thinking about it for weeks," she whispered. Jake's answering smile was soft, almost boyish. Then he released her, letting her return to the kitchen with a heart pounding like wild horses. Inside, Will was awake and complaining loudly about the bitter tea. The other cowboys hovered, their relief palpable. "Did I really almost die?" Will asked, wide-eyed. "You had a very close call," Margaret said gently. "But you're going to be fine. You'll even have an impressive scar to show off. Maybe I should get gored more often," Will joked weakly. Margaret wagged a finger at him. "Don't you dare." The men laughed, the sound breaking the tension like sunlight through clouds. But even as she bustled about tending to Will, Margaret's mind kept circling back to Jake's words. Something more. The phrase thrilled and terrified her in equal measure. She had come to the Circle M seeking only survival, a roof over her head and food on the table. She had never dared hope for love. And yet, when she thought of Jake, the way he'd read poetry by lamplight to calm Will, the way he'd held her during the storm, her heart ached with a fierce, impossible longing. That evening, as Will slept peacefully, Margaret stood at the kitchen window. The prairie stretched endlessly beneath the stars, wild and beautiful. Somewhere out there, Jake was riding the range, finishing tasks that never seemed to end. But he'd return. He always returned now. Margaret touched the cold window pane, her reflection shimmering in the lamplight. The woman who had arrived 3 months ago, a desperate widow, was gone. In her place stood a frontier woman. Capable, strong, unafraid of hard work or hard choices. A woman who could save lives, feed hungry men, and maybe, just maybe, love again. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had been forged, meal by meal, laugh by laugh, storm by storm. Now, as the wind whispered through the grass outside, Margaret knew one truth with bone-deep certainty. She didn't just belong at the Circle M. She belonged with Jake Caldwell. The next morning, Jake appeared in the doorway, wearing his good jacket despite it being a workday. His face was unusually serious. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said formally, and Margaret's stomach sank. That tone couldn't mean anything good. "Could you spare a moment in my office?" His voice was unreadable. Margaret wiped flour from her hands, her heart pounding. Was this it? Was he about to send her away or ask her to stay forever? Following him down the short hallway felt like walking to a trial. Her palms were damp, her breath shallow. The office was neat but masculine, books lining one wall, a painting of Texas hill country behind the desk. It felt like stepping into Jake's private world. "Please sit," he said, remaining standing by the window, his back to her. Margaret perched on the edge of the chair, gripping her skirt. "Your 3 months are up," Jake began without preamble. "It's time we discuss your position here." Margaret's throat was dry. "If my work has been unsatisfactory..." Jake turned sharply, cutting her off. "Your work has been exemplary." The word hung in the air, thick with meaning. Margaret's breath caught. "The men have never been better fed or better cared for," Jake continued, his voice steady now. "The kitchen runs smoother than it ever has. And you've handled emergencies that would have sent lesser folks running for town." Relief warred with confusion in Margaret's chest. "Then, why do you sound so grave?" Jake moved closer, leaning against the edge of his desk. His gray eyes were stormy, unreadable. "The question isn't whether I want you to stay, Margaret. The question is whether you want to." Margaret blinked. Of course I do. Unless you're dismissing me?" "No," Jake said firmly. Then, after a deep breath, "I'm asking if you want to remain here just as my cook, or if you might consider a different role." Her pulse thudded like a runaway horse. What role?" Jake reached into his coat and pulled out a small velvet box. Slowly, he opened it. Inside lay a simple gold band, set with a single sapphire, modest, beautiful, perfect. Margaret gasped softly, her hands flying to his aunt, and her mouth. "Jake." "Or," he said quietly, "you could become my wife." The room spun around her. Margaret gripped the chair's arms, her mind whirling faster than the prairie wind. "I know it's sudden," Jake said, kneeling so they were eye level. His voice trembled with emotion. "I know you came here seeking work, not love. But these past months, Margaret, you've brought life back to this place. To me." Tears burned Margaret's eyes. "Jake, I'm a widow. I'm older than you. I'm set in my ways." "You're the woman who made me remember why mornings are worth facing," he interrupted gently. "You turned this cold house into a home. You faced down storms, bulls, and cowboys with equal courage. Even that damned stove." Despite her tears, Margaret laughed shakily. The stove was the most frightening. "Margaret." Jake's hands covered hers where they gripped the chair. "I won't hide debts or truths like Charles did. This life is hard, and I can be a stubborn fool. But I promise you partnership, respect, and if you'll let me, love." Her breath caught. "Love? I've been fighting it for weeks," he admitted, raw honesty in his eyes. "Telling myself it was too soon, too complicated. But when Will lay dying and you fought for him, when you looked at me during that storm with such trust, I knew. Life's too short to waste chances at happiness." Margaret's mind whirled. She thought of Philadelphia, of debts and shame, of loneliness so sharp it had cut her hollow. Then, she thought of this ranch, of laughter in the kitchen, Will's recovery, Jake's hand steadying her during the storm, of a life hard, but real. "There's something you should know," she said slowly, her voice shaking. "About why I really came west." Jake's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Tell me." "Charles didn't just leave me with debts," she whispered. "He left me with lies. Other women. Gambling. Our entire marriage was a carefully polished illusion. I came west because I needed to go somewhere. No one knew my shame. Somewhere I could rebuild." Jake's expression softened. "And who is Margaret Sullivan now?" Margaret's tears spilled freely. "She's a woman who can burn biscuits and laugh about it. Who can set bones and stitch wounds. Who finds joy in feeding hungry men and sewing curtains from scraps." She looked straight into his eyes. "She's a woman who might be brave enough to love again, if the right man asked." "I'm asking," Jake said simply, his voice breaking. Margaret swallowed hard, her heart aching with joy. "Then I'm saying yes." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Jake's face lit with a smile so tender it took her breath away. He slid the ring onto her trembling finger. "There's one condition." Margaret froze. "Condition? You must promise to season our life with laughter," Jake said, his thumb brushing away a tear. "Even when the stove misbehaves, when the cowboys track mud across your clean floor, or when I'm at my most stubborn." A watery laugh escaped her. "Jake Caldwell, I promise you so much laughter, you'll beg for quiet." "Never," he said fiercely, pulling her into his arms. "I've had enough quiet for a lifetime." Their kiss was deep and unhurried, a binding vow made not in words but in touch. Outside, the ranch bustled on, unaware of how its heart had just changed forever. When they finally parted, breathless and laughing, Jake brushed his forehead against hers. "The men are going to be insufferable when they find out. Tom's probably running a betting pool on when I'd propose." Margaret chuckled. "Who do you think won? My money's on Tom himself. That boy's too clever by half." He rose, pulling her up with him. "When would you like to marry? I know women like time to plan." Margaret smiled through tears. "Jake, I'm 43 years old. I've already had the elaborate wedding with all the trimmings. This time, I want simple. Just you, me, and a life built on truth." "Christmas," Jake said after a moment. "A new beginning for a new year." Margaret's breath hitched. "Christmas. Yes. Though you realize that means I'll be cooking my own wedding feast." Jake grinned. "Then I'll help. We'll make it together." When they stepped out of the office, hand in hand, half the ranch's men were loitering nearby, each pretending very badly to be there by coincidence. Tom was the least subtle of the bunch. His grin stretched ear to ear as his eyes locked on the sapphire glimmering on Margaret's finger. "About time," he crowed. "Mrs. Sullivan, soon to be Mrs. Caldwell, you've gone and made an honest man out of our boss." Jake crossed his arms, feigning sternness though his mouth twitched with amusement. "Bradley, don't you have chores?" "Yes, sir," Tom said cheerfully. "But congratulating you two seemed like an urgent priority." The other cowboys erupted into cheers and whistles. A few even pounded Jake on the back so hard Margaret worried they'd break his arm next. One rough-voiced cowboy called out, "You've done more than tame a wild stallion, Mrs. Sullivan. You've tamed the whole Circle M." Margaret's cheeks burned, but she couldn't stop smiling. These men, dusty, loud, and entirely unrefined, had become her family. That evening, during supper, Jake stood to make the announcement official. "Gentlemen," he said, his deep voice carrying over the clatter of tin plates, "Mrs. Sullivan has agreed to marry me. Christmas Day. You're all invited." The cheer that went up could have lifted the roof clean off. Bill banged his mug on the table like a drum. Frank whistled. Even old Pete wiped a suspicious tear from his eye. "To the bravest woman and the best cook in Texas," Tom toasted, lifting his coffee cup high. "Hear, hear," the others roared, banging the table in unison. Margaret's throat tightened as she looked around at their faces. These rough men weren't just celebrating a marriage. They were celebrating the home they'd all built together. As the evening wore on, cowboys stopped by the kitchen one by one, offering shy congratulations. One brought a handful of wildflowers, another a polished horseshoe for luck. Margaret tucked each gift away like a treasure, her heart full to bursting. Later, as she washed dishes, Jake insisted on drying. "Let me help," he said, swiping a dish towel from her hands. "You'll get soap all over your vest," she protested, laughing. "It's worth it," he said simply. And for a moment, Margaret thought her heart might burst. They spoke of practical things where she would move her belongings, how to rearrange the house for two instead of one, which rooms needed curtains or rugs. "Our home," Margaret said softly, tasting the words like honey. Jake's expression softened. "Our home," he echoed, sealing the promise with a kiss. Snow began to fall in early December, blanketing the ranch in soft white silence. Preparations for the wedding took on a magical glow. Tom rode to town 3 times for supplies, each time returning with tales of townsfolk buzzing with excitement about the Christmas wedding. Bill and Frank scrubbed the main room until the wooden floors gleamed, grumbling good-naturedly the whole time. Even old Pete contributed, carving a wooden cross to hang above the fireplace as a wedding gift. Margaret sewed by firelight in the evenings, working on small touches. New curtains for the windows, a delicate table runner for the feast. Jake often sat beside her, silently doing ranch accounts or whittling scraps of wood into tiny figurines for the children of neighboring families. Sometimes they spoke softly, planning their future. Other times, they simply shared. The quiet. The kind that felt warm instead of lonely. "Are you nervous?" Jake asked one night, watching her stitch. "Excited," she admitted, "and maybe a little overwhelmed. I never imagined this." Jake reached over, taking her hand. "Neither did I. I thought my life was set: work, cattle, and silence. Then you came along." Margaret's eyes glistened. "Silence isn't always peace, is it?" "No." His voice was rough with emotion. "But laughter makes even the hardest days bearable." On Christmas Eve, Margaret stood at the kitchen window, watching the sunset bathe the snow-covered prairie in rose and gold. Tomorrow, she would become Margaret Caldwell. The kitchen was alive with scents: cinnamon, nutmeg, roasting meat, and fresh bread. She'd been cooking for 2 days straight, preparing for the feast that would follow their wedding. Jake appeared in the doorway, leaning casually against the frame. "You should rest. It's bad luck to exhaust the bride before the wedding." Margaret turned, her face glowing with happiness despite the flour dusting her cheeks. "I'm too happy to be tired." "Still," he said with a teasing smile, "let me steal a kiss before you collapse." Margaret laughed, allowing him to pull her into his arms, the snow falling silently outside as the warmth of their shared future surrounded them. Christmas morning dawned clear and brilliant, the snow sparkling like diamonds under the rising Sunday. The whole world seemed scrubbed clean, ready for a new beginning. Margaret woke in her small room off the kitchen for the very last time. Today, she would leave it behind and move into the main house, into the room Jake had quietly prepared for them. Mrs. Patterson from the boarding house arrived early with a flurry of bustling energy, declaring, "A bride doesn't lift a finger on her wedding day. Now, shoo. We'll handle the cooking." Margaret laughed as she was shepherded out of her beloved kitchen, her heart fluttering like a young girl's. She bathed and dressed carefully, donning the deep blue wool gown Jake had given her, now perfectly tailored. She pinned a sprig of dried lavender in her hair, a simple yet meaningful touch. When she looked in the mirror, the reflection that stared back wasn't the desperate widow who had arrived in Willow Creek months ago. It was a woman reborn through struggle, laughter, and love. A soft knock came at the door. "Margaret, may I come in?" Jake entered, freshly shaved and wearing a black suit she'd never seen before. It fit him perfectly, accentuating his strong frame and quiet dignity. His eyes widened when he saw her. "You're breathtaking," he said, his voice rough. Margaret blushed. "You clean up rather well yourself, Mr. Caldwell." He smiled and handed her a small, flat box. "This belonged to my mother. I'd like you to have it." Inside was a delicate gold chain with a tiny locket. When Margaret opened it, she found 2 tiny photographs, one of Jake's parents, the other side empty. "Waiting for our future," Jake said softly, fastening it around her neck. "Whatever it brings." Tears shimmered in Margaret's eyes. "Thank you, Jake. I'll treasure it always." The main room had been transformed with pine boughs, ribbons, and candles. Cowboys stood awkwardly in their cleanest shirts, while townsfolk crowded in, faces beaming with excitement. Reverend Matthews, his Bible in hand, cleared his throat. "Shall we begin?" Margaret took Jake's hand. As they faced the preacher, she saw the cowboys' grins, Tom's barely contained excitement, and Mrs. Morrison's proud tears. The ceremony was simple, but the words carried weight. "I do," Jake said firmly, his voice ringing with certainty. "I do," Margaret echoed, her voice trembling but strong. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up shook the rafters. Cowboys stomped their boots, townsfolk clapped, and someone whistled so loudly it made Margaret laugh. Jake kissed her, not caring who saw. It was a kiss of promise, of shared struggles and shared dreams. The feast that followed was a glorious chaos. Long tables groaned under platters of roasted meats, pies, and breads. Margaret's careful planning had paid off, with help from the town women and her ranch family. Tom raised his cup. "To Mrs. Caldwell, the woman who gave this ranch its heart back." "Here, here," the cowboys chorused, banging their mugs. Margaret's cheeks flushed with joy as she looked at their faces, men who had once been strangers but were now family. When the laughter lulled, Jake stood, pulling Margaret to his side. 6 months ago, this was just a place to work and sleep, he said, his voice carrying through the room. Now, it's a home, and that's because of Margaret. The men erupted in another round of cheers, louder than before. Even old Pete wiped his eyes with the corner of his bandana. As evening fell, music filled the air. Cowboys played fiddles and harmonicas, while couples danced on the cleared floor. Snow glittered outside the windows, reflecting the warm light inside. Margaret danced with Jake, her head resting against his shoulder. "Happy?" he asked softly. "Beyond words," she whispered. This is everything I never dared hope for. "And it's only the beginning," Jake promised, kissing her temple. Later, she slipped outside for a moment of quiet. The prairie stretched endlessly, glowing beneath the moonlight. Snowflakes drifted lazily, landing like blessings. Jake followed, draping his coat over her shoulders. "Cold?" "No," Margaret said, leaning into him. "Not with you here." Inside, someone began to sing Silent Night. Voices joined in harmony, the sound carrying through the crisp winter air. "Our first Christmas," Margaret murmured. "The first of many," Jake replied, his voice filled with quiet wonder. They stood together, watching the stars. "Our life will have storms," he said, "and lean seasons, and plenty of mud tracked across your clean floors." Margaret smiled. "And laughter. Don't forget the laughter." "Never," he vowed, kissing her under the winter sky. When they returned inside, the cowboys roared with cheers again. Margaret laughed, realizing that for once, she wasn't just surviving, she was living. That night, after the guests left and the last dish was set aside for morning, Jake took her hand. No more separate quarters. No more careful distance. "Just us. Just us," Margaret agreed, the sound of her new name singing in her heart. Margaret Caldwell. Outside, snow fell silently, blanketing the ranch in peace. Inside, the kitchen glowed with warmth and promised the same stove that had once been her enemy, now a symbol of the life she'd built. The advertisement had promised only room and board. It had delivered far more: a home, a family, and a love worth every hardship. As Jake wrapped his arms around her, Margaret knew that whatever challenges the wild Texas frontier held, they would face them together. The desperate widow who had boarded a stagecoach months ago was gone. In her place stood a strong woman, a ranch wife, and a partner who had found her place in the world and in Jake Caldwell's heart. A year later, the Circle M Ranch stood stronger than ever. Winter had given way to spring, and the prairie was alive with wildflowers and the distant lowing of healthy cattle. The house, once stark and silent, now brimmed with life. Laughter floated from the kitchen, mingling with the smells of fresh bread and coffee. The curtains Margaret had sewn swayed gently in the breeze. Margaret stood at the stove, expertly flipping biscuits while humming a cheerful tune. The same stove that had once terrified her now felt like an old friend. A pair of small boots clattered across the wooden floor, followed by a peal of giggles. Tom's niece, visiting for the week, chased the family dog in happy chaos. "Careful there," Margaret called, smiling. "Jake doesn't like muddy paw prints." As if summoned, Jake appeared in the doorway, tall and commanding, yet softened by the peace of the past year. His hat was pushed back, a smudge of dirt on his cheek. "Muddy paw prints I can live with," he said, crossing the room to kiss Margaret's cheek. "It's the chickens in the parlor I draw the line at." Margaret laughed, leaning into him. The love between them had only deepened, shaped by seasons of shared labor and quiet moments by the fire. Tom entered next, his arm fully healed, now one of the ranch's most skilled riders. He carried a sack of pecans gathered from the range. "Special delivery for Mrs. Caldwell," he said with a grin. "Thought you might make those cinnamon rolls the boss likes so much." Margaret's heart warmed. "Jake's favorite," she murmured, remembering the faded note in his mother's cookbook, the one that had started it all. Jake squeezed her hand. "Everything tastes better when you make it." The kitchen door banged open, and a rush of cold spring air swept in with Bill and Frank, each laughing as they jostled for the first cup of coffee. "Mrs. Caldwell, you've spoiled us rotten," Bill declared, inhaling deeply. "I remember when coffee here tasted like burnt leather." That was before Margaret saved this place from culinary ruin, Frank teased, earning a mock glare from Jake. As the room filled with chatter, Margaret looked around and felt her heart swell. This wasn't just a kitchen. It was the heart of the ranch, a refuge for everyone who walked through its door. Later that evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold, Margaret and Jake stood together on the porch, watching the cattle graze peacefully. "Remember our first storm?" Jake asked softly, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. Margaret smiled, leaning into his warmth. "How could I forget? You nearly got yourself killed, and I nearly drowned in biscuit dough." He chuckled, the sound rich and full of life. "We've come a long way since then." "We have," she agreed, her gaze sweeping over the land that had once seemed wild and unforgiving. "This isn't just a ranch anymore. It's home." Jake turned her to face him, his gray eyes filled with love. "You made it that way, Margaret. You gave me back something I thought I'd lost forever." Margaret's throat tightened. "And you gave me something I never thought I'd find again." Above them, the first stars began to appear, twinkling in the deepening twilight. It was the same sky that had once felt vast and lonely. Now, it felt like a blessing. Jake kissed her, slow and sure. "Whatever storms come, we'll face them together." Margaret's hand tightened on his. "And we'll season our life with laughter," she promised. "Always." Inside, the cowboys' voices rose in laughter. Someone strummed a guitar, the music spilling out into the evening air. Margaret glanced back at the warm glow of the kitchen windows. That small advertisement, folded and faded now, still lay tucked inside her Bible, a reminder of the path that had brought her here. It had promised room and board. Instead, it had given her everything: a family, a purpose, and a love so steady it could weather any storm. As the night settled softly over the prairie, Margaret Caldwell rested her head on her husband's shoulder, her heart full. In the vast, wild Texas frontier, where anything could happen, she and Jake had found their way home to each other. And that, Margaret thought with a smile, was the perfect recipe for happiness.